All right, guys, so we have officially finished up our unit on biotechnology. We're switching gears and we're going to talk all about ecology for the next 2 or 3 weeks. This is one of my favorite units to teach. I really love studying the way organisms interact with each other and the environment, and kind of uh, analyzing how if you take out one part of the system, the whole system goes to chaos, or if you have too much of something, then how that changes other things. It's one of my passions, something that I really like talking about, so I can't wait to explore this topic with you. But today, just like with most of our first lectures of the unit, this is going to just be an introduction on ecology and ecosystems. So if you will, get out your brand new notebooks. We're going to start with the very first doodle note page. It has a bunch of circles on it, and it is labeled ecology. I'm going to put this video up for you on Canvas. Check it out. It talks about the basics of ecosystems from, I think his name is Wild Dan or something. Interesting name. Maybe I'll give myself a nickname like that sometime. But he talks about ecosystems and how we define them, how they interact, and maybe some of the North Carolina ecosystems around you. So definitely worth watching and checking out. But let's dive right into it. So, like I said, this is where we're going. These are our ecology notes, so find this page in your notebook. So first, we're going to define ecology. So this is the study of interactions between organisms and their environment. Remember, when we defined our different prefixes and suffixes, ology is the study of, eco is kind of like life. Less like life interactions is what eco means. And then if you were in class with me, I would ask you, what do you think the interaction between Tom and Jerry is? Hope you've subconsciously answered this, but the interactions between Tom and Jerry, Tom is definitely the predator, although always unsuccessful because he never actually eats Jerry. Jerry is the prey. The whole kind of series circulates around their predator-prey interactions, and it's become a enterprise and entertainment for generations to come. Tom and Jerry originally started off when TV was black and white, so it's been quite a long time of those running, and they're still good today. When we talk about ecology, we always start by talking about this hierarchy of life, which is what we're about to get into. So we're going to start really, really small with the smallest classification of life, if you will, and then we're going to work all the way up to the largest classification of life, which we call the biosphere. So starting off real quick with the very smallest is the individual. So this is the organism, an individual living thing. So like I would be an individual, you would be an individual. The frog on my picture is an individual. A cricket could be, a plant could be. It's just whatever that one thing is, just one of them. So it could be a mite, could be a tick, just one thing. And then as we move up, once we start to group those individuals, that's when we call it a population. So it's a group of organisms of one type, species, that lives in the same area. So note, and an important note, and something I would make sure you understand, a population is only going to be within the same species. So if I and my dog were together, we would not be a population because we're two different species. But if we were sitting, like we are or will be, in a classroom full of students and teachers, that's a population because we're all the same species. Now, if you incorporate our Venus flytrap class pet, that is no longer a population because they are a different, Flynn is a different species than you and me. Some other populations you might see, you could see a population of geese flying around or hanging out in your local pond. You could see a population of frogs or a population of tadpoles, or if you have a garden, one individual row might be a population of green bean plants or tomato plants, right? If you have flower pots, maybe you have petunias in all of your flower pots, then that's a population of petunias. Now, it's important to know, though, that even though it's the same species, we're not talking about the entire species as a whole, globally, wherever they are. We're just talking about all the species, all of the organisms of the same species in the same geographic area. So if our geographic area here was Emeru, then all of the students and teachers and faculty of Emerald would be the same population because we're the same species, but we would not classify our folks at West Bladen or Elizabethtown Middle as part of our population because they aren't in our defined area. Now, maybe if we did all students and teachers in Bladen County, then they would be. It just depends on how you define this area. Typically, when we talk about population in ecology, we're talking about in a defined ecosystem. Usually we'll have boundaries of that ecosystem, though sometimes species do cross the boundaries. Could be like mountain divides, maybe it's a really steep mountain. It could be when the geographic area changes from one thing to another. So like if we go to the from the Piedmont maybe to the foothills, okay? But just that same defined areas of population. Once we start incorporating more organisms of different species, we call that a community. So me and all the students in the classroom and Finn, we would be a community. We're a population that live together in a defined area. In my example here on your notes, that frog, the cattail, and the snake all make up a community because they are all living. That's one of the important things. Everything in a community is living. And they are all living together in a defined area. In this case of our paper, it's our bubble or maybe our swamp. If we think bigger out into the population of Emaru, we could even expand it to, I don't know if other teachers even have class pets, put it in quotes because Finn's a plant, but have plants in their classroom. But maybe we could talk about the community of Emaru, so all of the living things that are on our defined property. So that could be the grass or the ants or the spiders that we see or the crickets, or it could be the trees that we see or the weeds. Are you getting what I'm saying? So it's everything that's living in a defined area. Now, the topic of our study is ecosystems, so we're getting to the nitty-gritty of this. This is the 1, 2, 3, 4th largest of our classifications when we talk about the hierarchy of life. An ecosystem is the community of organisms and all its non-living surroundings. So here's where we incorporate things like water and air and salt and nitrogen and phosphorus and all the kind of things that make up a place. So we could talk about the soil too. What else? It might be, so living things are pretty easy to identify, right? They're anything that breathes or does cellular respiration, and in the case of plants, photosynthesis. Non-living things are harder to think about, but I want you to think water, air, and earth, okay? So the water of the ecosystem, the air of the ecosystem, any kind of soil that the ecosystem is in, the chemicals of the ecosystem. And remember, when we're talking living things too, don't forget those things that you can't see, like our bacteria and fungus, right? Those are also part of our communities and ecosystems, right? So if you can see here in my ecosystem, we've included some living things like our dragonflies and our koi fish and my frog and the lily pad and the cattail still. But we also have non-living things like the air and that rock and the water, right, and the soil that the plants would be growing out of. Good. Next, when we move on, we're getting even larger now. It's called a biome. Ooh, my bad, we just gave away some answers here. But anyways, a biome is a large naturally occurring community of flora, fancy scientific word for plants. I would learn that. And fauna, fancy scientific word for animals, that occupy a major habitat, and I spelled that wrong, there's no E on the end. Okay, we have 5 major types, but if you notice my note here, there are further categories, so we separate these into further categories as well. But for right now, all I want you to know are the 5 major ones. So we have aquatic ecosystems, like our oceans are our freshwater, might be 2 ways that we further categorize those. We have our grasslands, also known as our savannas. We have forests, both tropical rainforests and deciduous forests. And there's another one, but I can't quite recall it at this time, but I will soon remember it. Alpine forest, there it is. Alpine forest. We have our deserts and we have our tundras. So a desert, think like Sahara Desert, little water, lots of heat and drought-resistant plants. Tundra is up in Siberia and parts of Canada, where it's not quite a frozen wasteland, but the ground is impermeable It has permafrost in there. That means that part of the ground stays frozen all year long. We'll dive more into those in a later date. But what biome do we live in? Do you know? Technically, North Carolina is classified as a deciduous forest, which means that the leaves change colors, basically. But we're in a forest land. If you remember back to our lecture on goods from the woods, I think it's something like 60% of North Carolina is covered in forest land. So, important to know. You could see that. I mean, if you looked out the window, most likely you're going to see forest land if you live in Bladen County. Right? And a map of all, I told you, remember, they separate these biomes into further categories, but you can see like our tundra is right here. Some tundra regions that we might have are these upper parts of Canada, parts of Greenland right here, and parts of Russia, though we've talked about this. My geography, once you get over into this region, is not always the best. Taiga is kind of like the tundra, just a little bit warmer, and the biomes kind of, if you will notice, the biomes kind of correlate with latitudinally where you are on the sphere, right? So if you're closer to the equator, you're more likely to have a desert or tropical rainforest type biome than, say, if you were near the poles, where you might have more likely a tundra type biome. If you look here, we are actually classified as a temperate steppe, which is kind of like a savanna here, although we're very close to a temperate broadleaf forest. So it is debatable as to what we are, and you could look up different maps of biomes and we might be classified as something different. It just depends on the classification system that the scientists use. Sometimes they use them solely based on latitude, but other times they take in type of vegetation as well, so the type of plants that grow into the system. And lastly, the very largest of our ecosystem classification is called the biosphere. So this is part of the Earth that contains all of the Earth's ecosystem. So my note here, nice and large for you, biosphere is pretty much the entire Earth. Okay. Now I have some questions for you, and they are all rhetorical, but hopefully they will stand to test your knowledge. So maybe try and write these down or guess these to see what classification system we might be. I'm going to show you some pictures. So what do you think this world is? Where would you place this on my classification of life here? Would you place it on the biosphere? I hope so, because that's what it is. The Earth, remember we talked about all the living things, or all the Earth that contains all of the ecosystems. That's our biosphere. Next picture here, we've got a group of wolves. What do you think those are in our classification system? I hope you said population, right? Because all of the wolves are the same species. We don't have any mice here. We don't have any plants in here, so it's not a community. And we have more than one wolf, so it's not an individual. It is definitely a population. They're all the same species. They all live in the same area. Population. Next, we have a beautiful coral reef. Includes fish and corals and water. What do you think this is? It is an ecosystem. You can see we've got all these different kind of species of coral. We've got the different species of fish. I see at least 1, 2, 3 right here in the forefront of the picture. If you go further back, you have even more types of shelf coral. Very awesome. So this is classified as an ecosystem because we're talking about the non-living substances here as well, like the soil that the coral grow out of and the water that they are surrounded in. What is this? I don't know if you know this little guy. He's we'll say a friend of mine, but I don't know. What would you classify this as in the hierarchy of life? He would be classified as an individual. This is called a tardigrade or the water bear. This is actually a microscopic organism that you might find in your water. And lastly, look at these guys, more microscopic organisms. I just don't think you see them enough. This is actually a community. We have different kinds of species. We have a mosquito larva here, a midge larva here, and an amite here. These are all microscopic things that, again, you might find in the water. This would be specifically pond water, though. I'm hoping you wouldn't find this in your drinking water. And I wanted to let you know that all these little guys live in this plant right here called the purple pitcher plant. and I have a video for you to watch. Enjoy your lecture. Have a great day.